I never thought my daughter's wedding day would be the one to break me. But that's the thing about life. It finds ways to test you when you least expect it. My name is Frank Mitchell, and at 62 years old, I thought I'd seen it all. I'd survived Vietnam, buried my wife after a grueling battle with cancer, and raised my daughter Sarah as a single father in a modest house in the suburbs of Boston. I'd worked my hands to the bone at my construction company for 40 years to give her everything she needed, and some things she wanted. College tuition, dance lessons, her first car, the down payment on her first apartment, even this wedding, which was costing me nearly my entire retirement savings. But none of that seemed to matter when my future son-in-law, Richard Harrington, pointed at me during their first dance and loudly declared to the room full of guests, "He doesn't belong here." I still remember how the room fell silent, how the string quartet's music seemed to fade into nothing, how my heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest and stomped on the parquet dance floor. But that moment, as painful as it was just the beginning. What happened next would change everything. I suppose I should start from the beginning. Sarah had always been the light of my life after her mother, Elizabeth, passed away from breast cancer when Sarah was only 8. I remember the night Liz died. Sarah crawled into bed with me, her small body shaking with sobs, and I promised her right then that I would always be there for her, that I would never let her down, that I would give her the life her mother would have wanted for her, and I tried my damnedest to keep that promise. I worked 10, sometimes 12-hour days at my construction business. Weekends too, when necessary. I'd come home exhausted, hands calloused and back aching, but I'd still help Sarah with her homework, attend her dance recitals, and make sure she never felt the absence of her mother too keenly. I wasn't perfect, far from it, but I did my best. I never remarried, though there were opportunities. Sarah was my priority, and I didn't want to risk bringing someone into our lives who might disrupt the stability we'd managed to create. When Sarah got accepted to Boston College, I couldn't have been prouder. She was the first in our family to go to university. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the acceptance letter, tears streaming down my weathered face. That night I sat alone in my workshop, looking at the photograph of Liz on my workbench, telling her about our daughter's achievement. "We did good, Lizzie," I whispered to the empty room. "We did good." I took out a second mortgage on the house to pay for her education. She never knew that. I didn't want her to worry about money. I wanted her to focus on her studies, to have the opportunities that neither Liz nor I ever had. And then, during her junior year, she met Richard. Richard Harrington came from money, old Boston money. His family owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Northeast. He had the kind of pedigree that spelled success from birth. Private schools, summers in the Hamptons, winters in Aspen. He had perfect teeth, perfect hair, and a perfect air of confidence that came from never having to wonder if he would succeed in life. The first time Sarah brought him home, I felt the divide immediately. He looked around our modest home with barely concealed disdain. His casual mention of his family's estate in Beacon Hill made my three-bedroom colonial in Dorchester feel like a shack. When Sarah proudly showed him the backyard garden I'd built for her mother years ago, he smiled politely and mentioned something about his family's landscape architect. But Sarah was smitten. I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at him as if he'd hung the moon. And who was I to stand in the way of her happiness? Besides, despite his privileged background, Richard seemed to genuinely care for my daughter. He was always polite to me, if somewhat distant. I told myself that was just the generational and social gap between us. What would a young, wealthy Boston elite have in common with an aging construction worker anyway? When they announced their engagement after Sarah's graduation, I swallowed my reservations and gave them my blessing. I remember Richard's handshake, firm, professional, like a business transaction. "I'll take good care of her, sir," he said, and I believed him, or wanted to believe him. The wedding planning began immediately, and it quickly became apparent that this would be no small affair. The Harringtons had a reputation to maintain, after all. When the initial estimates came in, I nearly had a heart attack. Even with the Harringtons covering a significant portion, my share would clean out my savings. But this was Sarah's big day, and I was determined to give her the wedding she deserved. I sold my boat, the one luxury I'd allowed myself after decades of hard work. I liquidated some investments. I even took out a loan against my business, all to see my little girl walk down the aisle in the wedding of her dreams. As the months passed, I noticed a subtle change in Sarah. She visited less frequently. Our Sunday dinners became monthly, then sporadic. When she did visit, she'd mention charity galas and country club events, a world so far removed from the one I inhabited that I could barely follow the conversation. She started correcting my grammar, gently suggesting different clothes, even buying me an expensive watch I was afraid to wear for fear of damaging it at work. Richard's family is very particular about appearances, she explained once, after suggesting I get my suit tailored before the wedding. I nodded and smiled, telling myself this was just pre-wedding jitters, that she was nervous about impressing her new family. Deep down, though, something felt wrong. A week before the wedding, I visited Sarah at the luxury apartment she now shared with Richard in Back Bay. I'd brought lunch, sandwiches from the deli we used to frequent when she was growing up. She accepted them with a tight smile, placing them on plates rather than eating from the wrappers as we always had. "Dad," she said carefully, setting her sandwich down after a single bite. "About the wedding. Richard and his mother have been talking, and they think it might be better if you don't give a speech at the reception." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Not give a speech, but I'm the father of the bride. "I know, Dad, but Richard is worried that you might feel uncomfortable with such a formal crowd. His father's college roommate is a senator, and there will be all these important people there. They're just looking out for you, really." I nodded slowly, tasting something bitter in my mouth that had nothing to do with the sandwich. "Whatever you want, sweetheart, it's your day." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, relief evident in her eyes. "Thanks for understanding, Dad. And there's one more thing. Would you mind not mentioning your construction business when you meet Richard's extended family? Maybe just say you're in property development or something like that." Another punch, this one lower and harder. The business I'd built from nothing that had put food on our table and paid for her education. She was ashamed of it. Of me? "Sure thing, kiddo," I managed, my voice rough. "Property development it is." The day of the wedding arrived, a perfect June afternoon at the Harrington family's estate in the Berkshires. The property was magnificent, with manicured lawns stretching as far as the eye could see, an ornate garden where the ceremony would take place, and a massive tent for the reception that could have housed my entire neighborhood. I arrived early, dressed in the new suit Sarah had insisted on buying me. It felt stiff and uncomfortable, like I was wearing someone else's skin. A valet took my keys with a look that made me suddenly conscious of my 15-year-old Ford pickup. Inside the estate, an army of workers was putting the finishing touches on the decorations. Flowers worth more than my monthly mortgage payment adorned every surface. Crystal chandeliers hung from the tent ceiling. A string quartet warmed up in the corner. I found Sarah in one of the upstairs rooms, surrounded by bridesmaids and stylists. When she saw me, her face lit up in a way that momentarily erased all my doubts and hurt feelings. She was beautiful, so much like her mother that it made my heart ache. "Dad," she exclaimed, rushing over to hug me carefully, mindful of her dress and makeup. "You're here." "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Pumpkin," I said, using the nickname I'd called her since she was a toddler. I noticed one of the bridesmaids, a friend of Richard's sister, smirk at the endearment. Sarah pulled back, examining me. "You look great, Dad, really great." I tugged awkwardly at my collar. "Thanks to you. Listen, sweetheart, I wanted to give you something." I pulled out a small velvet box from my pocket. Inside was a silver locket that had belonged to Elizabeth. I'd had it cleaned and polished, and inside I'd placed a tiny photograph of Liz holding baby Sarah. "It was your mother's," I explained as Sarah opened it, her eyes widening. "I thought, Well, I thought she should be here with you today in some small way. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Dad, she whispered, clutching the locket. For a moment, she was my little girl again. The one who used to climb into my lap for bedtime stories, who'd call for me after nightmares, who'd beam with pride when I showed up at her school events. One of the stylists cleared her throat. Sarah, we really need to finish your makeup. We're on a schedule. The moment broke. Sarah handed the locket back to me. Could you hold on to this for now? I don't want to ruin the neckline of my dress. Maybe I can carry it later or wear it at the reception. I pocketed the locket, trying to hide my disappointment. Of course, whatever you want. She kissed my cheek. I need to finish getting ready. The coordinator will show you where to wait until the ceremony. And just like that, I was ushered out, guided to a small sitting room where I was told to wait until it was time to walk Sarah down the aisle. I sat alone, feeling increasingly out of place among the antique furniture and oil paintings of Harrington ancestors. An hour later, a coordinator with a clipboard and an earpiece came to fetch me. "It's time, Mr. Mitchell," she said briskly. Walking Sarah down the aisle was a blur of emotions, pride, love, and an inexplicable sense of loss. She was radiant, clutching my arm perhaps a bit more tightly than necessary. When we reached the altar where Richard waited in his bespoke tuxedo, I kissed Sarah's cheek and placed her hand in his. "Take care of my little girl," I said, my voice thick. Richard smiled, perfect and polished. "Of course, sir." As I took my seat in the front row, I couldn't help but notice I was the only one sitting on the bride's side of the family. Sarah had no siblings and my parents were long gone. My brother couldn't make it from California due to health issues. A few of my closest friends were scattered among the seats, looking as out of place as I felt, but they were vastly outnumbered by the Harrington clan and their social circle. The ceremony was beautiful, if overly formal for my taste. Sarah and Richard exchanged vows they'd written themselves, hers heartfelt, his eloquent and clearly well-rehearsed. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause. I clapped until my hands hurt, blinking back tears. The reception began with cocktails on the lawn. I stood awkwardly near the bar, nursing a whiskey, watching as Sarah and Richard moved effortlessly through the crowd. They looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine, both beautiful, polished, perfect. Several times, Sarah caught my eye and smiled, but she was always whisked away to greet another important guest before she could make her way to me. Richard's father, Edward Harrington III, approached me eventually. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. "Frank," he said, extending his hand. "Quite a day, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," I replied, shaking his hand. "Beautiful wedding." "Indeed, Margaret outdid herself with the planning. Sarah seems like a lovely girl. You must be very proud." "I am, more than I can say," he nodded, taking a sip of his champagne. "Richard tells me you're in property development." I hesitated, remembering Sarah's request. "That's right. Interesting market these days. Any major projects currently?" Before I could formulate a suitably vague answer, we were interrupted by the announcement that dinner was about to be served. Edward clapped me on the shoulder. "We'll continue this later. You're at our table, of course." The dinner was an elaborate five-course affair with wines paired to each dish. I was seated at the head table between Richard's mother, Margaret, a slender, elegant woman who seemed physically incapable of fully smiling, and his aunt from Connecticut. Both made polite but minimal conversation with me, turning away whenever possible to speak with others at the table. I watched Sarah and Richard at the center of the table, heads inclined toward each other, occasionally kissing to the delight of the guests. They looked happy. That was what mattered, I told myself. Not my discomfort, not the way Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly whenever I spoke, not the fact that I'd barely exchanged 2 words with my daughter since giving her away. After dinner came the speeches. Richard's best man, a college friend who now worked at his father's investment firm, gave a speech full of inside jokes and anecdotes about their time at Yale. Richard's father spoke eloquently about legacy and family tradition, welcoming Sarah into their fold with practiced warmth. Even Richard's 14-year-old sister said a few words, clearly coached but still touching in her sincerity. No one from the bride's side spoke. I sat silently, the speech I would have given burning a hole in my pocket. I'd spent weeks writing it, practicing it in front of my bathroom mirror, making sure I wouldn't embarrass Sarah by getting too emotional or saying something inappropriate. Now it would go unheard. Then came the first dance. The string quartet transitioned to a popular love song, one I didn't recognize but the crowd clearly did, based on the appreciative murmurs. Richard led Sarah to the center of the dance floor, taking her in his arms with practiced ease. They moved gracefully, another reminder of the world of difference between us. I'd never been much of a dancer, despite Liz's patient attempts to teach me. About halfway through the song, Richard whispered something in Sarah's ear. She looked up at him, her expression changing from confusion to concern. He nodded toward where I sat, then leaned down to speak to her again. Sarah shook her head slightly, but Richard was already turning to face the crowd, his arms still around my daughter's waist. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying effortlessly across the tent. The music quieted, though it didn't stop completely. "I want to thank you all for sharing this special day with us." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. "Sarah and I are so grateful to be surrounded by family and friends as we begin our journey together." He smiled down at my daughter, who returned it weakly. Something was wrong. I could tell from the set of her shoulders, the way her hands had tensed against Richard's chest. "Family is everything to the Harringtons," Richard continued. "We value loyalty, tradition, and truth above all else." The tent had gone completely silent now. Even the quartet had stopped playing. "Which is why," Richard said, his voice hardening slightly, "I feel it's important to address something that's come to my attention today." He turned, looking directly at me, his arm extending to point in my direction. "This man sitting here, Frank Mitchell, who claims to be Sarah's father, he doesn't belong here." The words hit me like physical blows. Claims to be, doesn't belong. I felt the blood drain from my face as every eye in the tent turned to stare at me. "Richard," Sarah gasped, pulling away from him. "What are you doing?" He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on me. "It's time for the truth, Sarah. I've hired investigators. I know everything." My mind raced. What truth? What could he possibly know? I'd lived my life as an open book. I'd made mistakes, sure, but nothing that would warrant this public humiliation, this cruel accusation. "Frank Mitchell is not who he claims to be," Richard announced to the stunned crowd. "The man who raised my wife, the man who has been accepting our generosity and pretending to be a respectable business owner, is a fraud." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's enough," I said, my voice low but carrying in the silence. "I don't know what game you're playing, Richard, but this is your wedding day, your wife's wedding day. Don't do this here." "No, Frank," Richard replied coldly. "This ends now. I won't have my family name tainted by association with a criminal." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Sarah had gone completely pale, her eyes darting between Richard and me. "A criminal," I repeated, genuinely confused. "Son, I don't know what you think you know, but—" "I'm not your son," Richard snapped. "And I know that in 1985 you were arrested for fraud and embezzlement from your employer. You stole nearly $50,000 from the construction company where you worked before starting your own business." The room spun around me. 1985. The year everything had fallen apart. The year I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. That's not the whole story," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad," Sarah's voice broke through the roaring in my ears. She had stepped away from Richard, her beautiful face contorted in confusion and pain. "Is this true?" I looked at my daughter, my whole world, and saw the beginning of doubt in her eyes. It felt like losing Elizabeth all over again, that same crushing weight on my chest, that same inability to draw a full breath. "Sarah," I began, but Richard cut me off. "Show her the court records," he said, gesturing to a man in a dark suit who stepped forward, holding a manila folder. Show her how her father is nothing but a common thief who managed to avoid prison time. The man approached Sarah, offering her the folder. She didn't take it, her eyes still fixed on me. "Dad, please," she whispered. "Tell me it's not true." I closed my eyes briefly, memories of that terrible time washing over me. When I opened them again, I straightened my shoulders and looked directly at my daughter. "It's not the whole truth," I said firmly. "And your husband knows it." Richard scoffed. "What more is there to know? You stole money. You were convicted. The only reason you didn't go to prison is because the judge took pity on you since your wife was sick." And there it was, the piece of the story he deliberately left out, the context that changed everything. I felt a surge of anger cut through my shock and shame. "Yes, my wife was sick," I said, my voice growing stronger. "Your mother, Sarah. Elizabeth was dying of cancer, and our insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment that might have saved her life." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "What?" I stepped around the table, moving closer to my daughter. "I did take money from the company I worked for. Money I had earned in bonuses that they refused to pay during cutbacks, while the owners continued to live in luxury. I took what I thought I was owed to try to save your mother's life." The tent was so quiet you could hear the distant chirping of crickets outside. "It was wrong," I admitted. "I broke the law. I was desperate and afraid, and I made a terrible choice. When I was caught, I pleaded guilty. The judge was merciful because of the circumstances, giving me probation instead of jail time. I paid back every penny over the next 10 years, even after." My voice broke. "Even after the treatment didn't work, even after we lost her anyway." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "How could I asked softly. "How could I tell my little girl that her father was a thief, that I failed her mother, that all my efforts, even the illegal ones, couldn't save her? So I buried that part of my past and focused on raising you, on being the father you deserved." I turned to Richard, who was watching with a calculated expression that made my blood boil. "But what I want to know is why your husband felt the need to announce this at your wedding, in front of all these people. He's known for months. His investigators found out long ago. Why wait until today, until this moment, to humiliate both of us?" Sarah turned to Richard, wiping tears from her cheeks, smearing her perfect makeup. "Richard, is that true? You've known all this time?" Richard's expression hardened. "I needed to be sure, and I needed everyone here to know the truth about the man who raised you. The Harrington name means something in this community. I couldn't risk—" "Risk what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "Risk your precious reputation by having a father-in-law who made a desperate mistake 35 years ago, who was trying to save his dying wife." "It's not that simple," Richard began, reaching for her arm. "You have to understand." Sarah jerked away from his touch. "No, I understand perfectly. You waited until our wedding day, until I was legally bound to you, until it would cause maximum embarrassment, to reveal something you could have discussed with me privately months ago." Her voice grew harder with each word. "You didn't do this to protect your family name. You did it to control me, to isolate me from my father, to show everyone here that you have the power." The color drained from Richard's face. "Sarah, you're overreacting. This is just the shock talking." "Is it?" she challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, my husband just publicly humiliated the man who sacrificed everything for me, who worked himself to the bone to give me opportunities he never had, who never once complained about the second mortgage he took out to pay for my college education, or about draining his retirement fund to pay for this obscene display of wealth and privilege." Richard's jaw dropped. "Second mortgage? What are you talking about?" Sarah laughed, a bitter sound so unlike her usual warm giggle that it sent chills down my spine. "Of course you wouldn't know. You've never had to worry about money a day in your life. You have no idea what real sacrifice looks like." She turned away from him, moving to stand beside me. "My father may have made a mistake long ago, but at least he knows the meaning of love. Real love, not the conditional kind your family trades in." Richard's face flushed with anger. "You're making a scene." "No, you already did that," Sarah replied coolly. She reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "Dad, I'm so sorry, I had no idea." "It's okay, Pumpkin," I murmured, still stunned by her fierce defense. "You have nothing to apologize for." Margaret Harrington rose from her seat, her face a rigid mask of disapproval. "Richard, control your wife. This display is unseemly." Sarah whirled to face her mother-in-law. "Control me? Is that what marriage means to you? No wonder your son turned out the way he did." Gasps echoed around the tent. Even I was shocked by Sarah's boldness. Edward Harrington stood as well, his expression thunderous. "That's quite enough. Both of you sit down. We'll discuss this in private later." "There's nothing to discuss," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. "My father stays. He belongs here more than anyone. He's the only reason I'm here at all." Richard stepped forward, grabbing Sarah's arm roughly. "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed. "Think about what you're doing. Think about what you're throwing away." I moved instinctively, breaking his grip on my daughter's arm. "Don't touch her like that," I said quietly, a dangerous edge to my voice that I hadn't used since my days in Vietnam. For a moment, Richard looked afraid. Then his face hardened again. "Fine, if that's how you want it. But don't think you can come crawling back when you realize what a mistake you're making." Sarah laughed again, that same hollow sound. "The only mistake I made was not seeing you for who you really are until today." She turned to the stunned crowd. "I'm sorry, everyone, but it seems this wedding reception is over. Please enjoy the food and the open bar, courtesy of my father's life savings." With that, she took my hand and led me toward the exit of the tent. The crowd parted before us, faces showing everything from shock to pity to barely concealed delight at the scandal unfolding. As we stepped outside into the cool evening air, Sarah stumbled, her composure finally breaking. She turned to me, collapsing against my chest with a sob. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she cried, her whole body shaking. "I've been so blind, so stupid. The way I've treated you these past months, the things I asked you to change about yourself to hide. I'm so ashamed." I held her tightly, rocking her gently as I had when she was small. "SHH, it's okay, it's going to be okay." "No, it's not," she hiccuped through her tears. "I just left my own wedding. I humiliated myself in front of hundreds of people. I have nowhere to go, nothing that's mine, everything is tied to Richard now." "You have me," I said firmly. "You'll always have me. We'll figure this out together." She pulled back, wiping at her tears, leaving black mascara streaks across her cheeks. Despite the smeared makeup and the red eyes, she looked more like herself than she had all day, more like the strong, determined girl I'd raised. "First things first," she said, taking a deep breath. "I need to get out of this dress." I smiled, relief washing through me at this glimpse of my Sarah's practical nature. "Your overnight bag is still in my truck. Do you want me to get it for you?" She nodded, and I squeezed her shoulder before heading to the parking area. As I walked, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Richard's sister, Emma, rushing to catch up. "Mr. Mitchell," she called, slightly out of breath. "Wait, please." I stopped, wary. "What is it, Emma?" The 14-year-old looked around nervously before holding out her hand. In it was the silver locket I'd given Sarah earlier. "She left this on the vanity. I thought she might want it." I took the locket, surprised and touched by the girl's thoughtfulness. "Thank you, that's very kind of you." Emma bit her lip. "I'm sorry about what Richard did. It was awful." She hesitated, then added in a rush, "I heard him and Dad talking about it last week. They planned the whole thing. Dad said it would establish dominance in the marriage from the beginning." My stomach churned at her words. "Thank you for telling me, Emma, and for bringing the locket." She nodded, glancing back toward the tent where raised voices could now be heard. "I should go back before they notice I'm gone." She started to turn away, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think Sarah is really brave. And so are you." With that, she hurried back toward the reception, leaving me standing there with the locket clutched in my hand, my heart a tangle of rage, heartbreak, and surprisingly, hope. When I returned to Sarah with her bag, she had removed her veil and was sitting on a stone bench near the gardens, staring out at the darkening sky. I handed her the bag and the locket. Emma brought this, I explained as she took the locket with trembling fingers. She said some interesting things too. As Sarah ducked behind some shrubbery to change out of her wedding dress, I recounted my conversation with Emma. By the time Sarah emerged, dressed in jeans and a Boston College sweatshirt, her face washed clean of makeup, my truck keys were in my hand. "Ready to go home, Pumpkin?" I asked gently. She nodded, slipping the locket around her neck. "More than ready." As we walked toward the parking area, voices called out Sarah's name. We turned to see two of her bridesmaids, college friends, not Richard's sister's friends, running toward us, still in their formal dresses but with shoes in hand. "Sarah, wait," called Melissa, the shorter of the two. "Are you okay? What can we do?" Sarah hugged them both, fresh tears springing to her eyes. "I'm okay, or I will be. I'm going home with my dad." "Do you want company?" asked the other girl, Jen. "We can come with you. We've already called an Uber to get our stuff from the hotel." Sarah looked at me questioningly. I nodded. The more the merrier. And so we left, me, my daughter, and her two loyal friends, driving away from the Harrington estate in my old Ford truck, leaving behind the remnants of what should have been the happiest day of Sarah's life. The ride back to Boston was quiet at first. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, occasionally wiping away a stray tear. Her friends sat in the back, a silent support system. I focused on the road, my mind still reeling from the day's events. About halfway home, Sarah broke the silence. "Dad, I need to know everything. About what happened with Mom with the money." "All of it," I sighed, glancing at her briefly before returning my eyes to the road. "It's not a pretty story, Sarah. I still need to hear it, the whole truth." And so, as we drove through the Massachusetts night, I told her everything. About how Elizabeth's cancer had spread rapidly, how the doctors had given her 6 months to live, about the experimental treatment in Switzerland that wasn't covered by insurance, about my desperation as I watched my wife waste away while I felt powerless to help her. I told her about taking the money, not all at once, but gradually, disguising it as legitimate business expenses. How I justified it to myself, because the company owners had cut our bonuses that year despite record profits, claiming economic hardship while they bought new vacation homes. I explained how I'd been caught when a routine audit revealed the discrepancies, how I'd immediately confessed rather than drag things out. How the judge, a man who had lost his own wife to cancer years before, had shown mercy, giving me probation and a restitution order rather than prison time. "By then," I said, my voice rough with emotion, "the treatment had failed anyway. Your mother had less than a month left. The money was gone, and I was a convicted felon with a dying wife and an 8-year-old daughter to care for." Sarah reached across the console to squeeze my hand. "How did you manage? After Mom died, I mean." I smiled sadly. "One day at a time. Your grandmother helped a lot that first year. And then when I'd repaid enough of the restitution that I could get a loan, I started my own business. Built it from nothing, determined to give you the life your mother would have wanted for you. And you never told me any of this." "I wanted to protect you," I admitted. "I was ashamed of what I'd done, even though I'd do it again in a heartbeat if it meant a chance to save your mother. And as you got older, well, the right time never seemed to come up. You were doing so well, achieving everything we dreamed for you. I didn't want to burden you with my mistakes." From the backseat, Melissa spoke up hesitantly. "Mr. Mitchell, if you don't mind me saying, what you did was an act of love. It wasn't right, maybe, but it was understandable." I caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "Thank you, Melissa. That's kind of you to say." We drove the rest of the way in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When we finally pulled up to my house in Dorchester, Sarah stared at it like she was seeing it for the first time. The modest colonial with its slightly peeling paint, the garden I still maintained in Elizabeth's memory, the workshop in the back where I spent my weekends. "Home," she whispered, and the simple word carried such weight that I felt tears prick at my eyes. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah and her friends camped out in her old bedroom, which I'd kept largely untouched since she'd left for college. There were tearful phone calls, visits from more college friends, and an eventual, tense meeting with a lawyer to discuss the annulment proceedings. Richard had tried calling repeatedly that first day, his messages growing increasingly angry and then pleading. By the third day, it was his father's lawyers who called, offering a settlement if Sarah would agree to a quiet divorce after 6 months, rather than an immediate annulment that would draw more attention to the family's embarrassment. They're still trying to control the narrative, Sarah said bitterly after one such call, still more worried about appearances than anything real. A week after the wedding disaster, Sarah and I sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the garden. She'd been quieter that day, more contemplative. "I keep thinking about Mom," she said finally, "about what she would think of all this." I smiled, the familiar ache of missing Elizabeth softened by years of acceptance. "She'd be proud of you, for standing up for yourself, for seeing through the facade." Sarah fingered the locket around her neck. "I don't remember her very well anymore, just impressions, the smell of her perfume, the sound of her laugh. She was a lot like you," I said, "strong, principled. She wouldn't have let anyone push her around either. I wish I'd known about what happened back then, about what you did for her." I shook my head. "I'm not proud of breaking the law, Sarah. I wish I'd found another way." "But you did it out of love," she insisted. "Everything you've ever done has been out of love. For Mom. For me," she looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "While I let myself get swept up in Richard's world, in the status and the luxury. I started to believe I deserved it somehow, that I was special because these wealthy, powerful people had accepted me." "You are special," I said firmly. "But not because of them, because of who you are, your kindness, your intelligence, your determination." She leaned her head against my shoulder, just as she used to do as a child. "I think I lost sight of that for a while. Lost sight of who I really am." "We all get lost sometimes," I murmured. "The important thing is finding your way back." 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah returned to work at the environmental nonprofit where she'd been employed since graduation. Her colleagues welcomed her back with open arms, no questions asked. The story of what had happened at the wedding had spread, of course. Boston's social circles thrived on such scandal. But Sarah held her head high, refusing to be shamed for standing up for herself and for me. Richard's family attempted damage control, spreading rumors that Sarah had had a nervous breakdown at the wedding, that she'd been unstable for months. Few people believed them, especially after Emma, in an act of surprising rebellion, posted a social media message supporting Sarah and condemning her brother's behavior. As for me, I returned to my construction business, weathering the curious looks and whispered conversations that followed me for a while. The story of my past had come out, but strangely, I felt lighter for it. The secret I'd carried for so long was finally in the open, and the sky hadn't fallen. Some clients stopped doing business with me when they learned about my criminal record. Others, however, sought me out specifically, moved by the story of a father's desperate attempt to save his wife. One woman, the wife of a prominent doctor, hired me to renovate their kitchen after telling me that her husband had once broken medical ethics rules to get experimental medication for their son. "Sometimes love makes us do things we never thought we would," she said simply. "Sometimes the rules are wrong." 3 months after the wedding that wasn't, Sarah came to Sunday dinner with news. She'd been offered a position with an international environmental organization, a dream job that would take her to projects around the world, starting with 6 months in Costa Rica. "It's what I always wanted to do before," she trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. "Before Richard, before she'd been seduced by a world of privilege and status." "That's wonderful, Sarah," I said, genuinely happy for her despite knowing how much I would miss her. "Your mother would be so proud." "There's more," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "The annulment went through yesterday. It's officially like the marriage never happened." I raised my glass of iced tea. "To new beginnings." She clinked her glass against mine. "To new beginnings, and to the truth, all of it, good and bad." Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to leave, she lingered at the door, looking around the modest home where she'd grown up. You know, she said thoughtfully, Richard was wrong about so many things, but especially about you not belonging at that wedding. Oh, I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You were the only one who truly belonged there because you were the only one who loved me unconditionally. The only one who would have sacrificed everything for me, who has sacrificed everything for me. She hugged me tightly, and I held my daughter close, my heart full. I love you, Dad, she whispered. I love you too, Pumpkin, I replied. Always have, always will. As she drove away, I stood on the porch watching until her taillights disappeared around the corner. The evening was peaceful, the air scented with the late summer blooms from Elizabeth's garden. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the mistakes, the sacrifices, the painful truths and healing honesty. I thought about Richard pointing at me during that first dance, declaring I didn't belong, never knowing that his cruel act would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately free Sarah from a life of hollow privilege and return her to her true path. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes public humiliation can lead to private peace. Sometimes the truth, however painful, is the only path to redemption. And sometimes, when someone points at you and says you don't belong, the universe has a way of proving them spectacularly wrong. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.